Good morning and welcome to all online participants. I'm pleased to speak to you today and to present the Federal Republic's approach to dealing with objects on our collections with colonial origins. My presentation will be divided in the following sections. First, the structure of the museum landscape in Germany and the working methods of the Federation-Länder Working Group. Second, the framework principles, and third, guidelines for a three-road strategy on documentation and digital publication of the collections. Let me give you some background on how our setup came to exist. In order to understand the tasks of the Federation-Länder Working Group, it is necessary to know the constitutional structure of the Federal Republic of Germany. Germany initially consists of one singular federal state, the so-called Bund. The nation is then divided into 16 individual federal states or Länder, as they are commonly known. Within these states, there are further subdivisions at the municipal level. All three of these levels, federal, state, and local, can be sponsors of public institutions, especially museums, whose holdings may contain cultural assets from colonial contexts. Due to the independence of the Länder on cultural matters, the vast majority of museums are owned by the Länder and local authorities. In principle, the private and public owners of these collections decide on their own responsibility how they want to deal with these cultural assets, for example, whether they provide public information about their holdings or whether and under what conditions they return cultural assets to the society or country of origin. This means, for example, that the federal government has no power to decide on objects that are owned by a state or municipal museum. However, the federal, state, and local governments agree to actively assume their historical responsibility in dealing with Germany's colonial past. And they want to coordinate closely when dealing with this colonial past. In order to achieve the goal of coordinated action, a body composed of representatives from all three levels is needed. For this reason, the federal and state governments, together with the municipal umbrella organizations, agreed on October 12, 2018, to set up the Bund Länder AG, or Federation-Länder Working Group, on dealing with collections from colonial context to perform this task. Let me now present the working methods and results of this new working structure. The working group consists of representatives of the Länder, representatives of the Office of the Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and Media, the Federal Foreign Office, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Cultural Foundation of the Länder, as well as representatives of the municipal umbrella organizations. In addition, representatives of the German Museum Association, Deutscher Museumsbund, and the ICOM take part in the meetings. Almost all important decisions and agreements from recent years concerning the handling of cultural assets from colonial contexts were prepared in terms of content by the Federation-Länder Working Group. Particularly worthy of mention are the so-called framework principles for dealing with collections from colonial contexts. And also to be mentioned, the initiation of a German contact point for these collections. Professor Hilbert has already given you information about this contact point. As well as, and these are very recent, the guidelines for a three-road strategy on the documentation and digital publications of the collections. The framework principles for dealing with collections from colonial contexts were adopted by the politically responsible bodies at federal, state, and municipal level in March 2019. I would like to briefly outline the main points and statements of these principles. First, a clear commitment to Germany's colonial past and the resulting political responsibility. Second, the objective of conducting the reappraisal of the colonial past in a process based on partnership and on equal terms with the states and societies formerly affected by colonialism. Third, the framework principles also contain a clear commitment to the return of cultural property that was acquired unlawfully or unethically. In addition to these key statements, the framework principles identify 6 areas of activity in which the signatories want to make progress and which are considered indispensable for coming to terms with the colonial past. The most important are, with this first on being a priority, transparency and documentation. We acknowledge the importance of conducting inventories and digitizing collections from colonial contexts, and we are examining ways to support institutions which hold such collections. I will deal with this goal separately in the last point of my presentation. Second point, provenance research. Provenance research forms the basis for assessing the origin of the collection and the circumstances of acquisition. Research is also intended to determine whether an appropriation took place by force or without the consent of the entitled person. Third, return. It is seen as an ethical moral obligation to identify and return cultural assets from colonial context whose appropriation took place in a legally or ethically unacceptable manner today. Human remains from colonial contexts are generally to be returned. The institutions preserving cultural property are called upon to independently and proactively identify collection items for which repatriation is possible even without a prior request. Fourth, cultural exchange and international cooperation. The responsible handling of collection materials from colonial contexts requires dialogue, exchange, and cooperation with the countries of origin and the societies of origin concerned. Lastly, one of the most urgent tasks named in the framework principles is to create transparency regarding the cultural assets in our collections, because only the greatest possible transparency enables worldwide participation. The politically responsible committees adopted the so-called three-road strategy in October this year. In order to understand the three-road strategy, it is important to know that there are a wide range of scientific collections in Germany in terms of processing and documentation. Some collections are, at least in part, already available online. Other collections are still in the very early stages of being catalogued. The three-road strategy contains the following key statements. The greatest possible transparency is a requirement for successful work in all other areas of the framework principles, in particular for a potential return. The three-road strategy provides for 3 equivalent approaches, which all help reach the long-term goal of the greatest possible degree of transparency. The main advantage of this strategy is that, despite the magnitude and complexity of the challenge, quick and ongoing results can be achieved without losing sight of the medium and long-term tasks. The three-road strategy is to be planned and implemented with the help of experts from the countries and societies of origin as well as the diaspora in Germany. And as its name suggests, it provides for three different paths. Route 1 is access, which is the short-term goal. Creation of a central access to collection from colonial contexts which have already been published digitally. Route 2 is transparency, our medium and long-term plan. The basic digitization and digital publication of still unpublished collections from colonial contexts in a central data repository. Route 3 is cooperation, which is long-term. Digitization and digital publication of collections based on standards devised in collaboration with countries and societies of origin, as well as the diaspora in Germany. We plan to test the three-road strategy initially in a pilot phase with 10 to 12 facilities. These should be museums, but also other institutions with scientific collections, such as universities. As you can see, the federal, state, and local governments, together with their museums, are on a consistent path here. This is a task that we are tackling with determination, but one that will occupy us for a long time. Yet, it is a task that we look forward to and that will help us to get to know the entanglements and complications of our own history and to enter into a new dialogue. With that, I thank you for your attention on this important topic and for your interest in the setup and ideas behind the Federation-Länder Working Group. I would expect that you still have comments and questions on the topic. But because the next panel of the conference is now beginning, I would invite you to submit your comments in writing in the chat so that we may consider them later during the conference. Thank you for your attention.